Mr Bishop, how are you getting on with that wasp?
What pretentious nonsense. I don't know if Mr Mitchell actually knows what the phrase pitbull chewing a wasp actually means. I suggest he Googles it. It's actually reasonably offensive to me and also Parmjeet Parmar, but that is generally in keeping with the tone of debate from Bernie Sanders light over there from New Zealand First. Because he stood up and said, well, Mr Bishop's going to get up here with his rhetoric. Well, that was a speech full of rhetoric. That was a speech full of highfalutin rhetoric about the minimum wage, and I do want to respond to three of the points he made about the minimum wage. So firstly, he said, we can't expect people on $15.25 an hour to provide for families, and that is true. That is why, if you are someone who is earning at the minimum wage and you have children, the government provides working for families payments so that you can look after those children. It's why the government provides social support through the $2 billion a year we provide in the accommodation supplement. He talks about high rents. That's why we have the accommodation supplement, to make sure that families can afford rental housing. So it's true that there are a lot of people. There are some people out there who are earning the minimum wage. Often they are people who are students, people who are working at part-time. I've worked on the minimum wage. I was a barman actually working below the minimum wage in the United Kingdom. Lots of people have. The point is they're often entry-level jobs. They're often the jobs you get as you move up the career ladder. So there is a role for that. Second point I want to make is about the quantum of the minimum wage. We have one of the highest minimum wage rates in the developed world. Whether or not you measure that as a percentage of the median wage or whether or not you measure it as a percentage on a per capita basis, the reality is we have one of the highest legislated minimum wage rates in the developed world, and study after study and official advice after official piece of advice demonstrates that we have that. Third point in response to Mr Mitchell about minimum wage rates, he just pretends that you can legislate for higher wages. That was the theme of his speech. We need higher wages. Well, everybody agrees with that, and actually wages have been increasing, wage increases have been outstripping inflation rates for the last 8 years. But the government cannot just turn around and legislate to give everyone more money. This is the fantasy land economics that New Zealand First lives in. If the government could do that, we would. Now, Mr Mitchell thinks that this is a flinty and hard-hearted government, but he surely cannot pretend that this government is so hard-hearted that if we could just, with the wave of a magic wand, with a piece of legislation, with the stroke of a pen, give everyone $25 an hour and everyone on the minimum wage $30 or $50 an hour, we would not do that. Well, of course we would, but the reality is that is not how wages are worked out. And actually that would come at the cost of jobs. And that's why every time they stand up and say we need to make sure everyone gets a living wage and we need to increase minimum wage rates, they neglect the importance of actually making sure that there are sustainable jobs out there in the economy. We have increased the minimum wage rate, and we've done so in a sustainable way. It has been increased every year we've been in government, and because it is important to make sure those who are earning not a large amount of money, they do share in the benefits of economic growth, and that's what we've ensured. So that deals with the silly speech from Mr Mitchell. Let me talk, sir, about the bill. And my colleague Maurice Williamson, in the first reading of this bill, talked about how this bill was an example of the Mahari principle, the Steve Mahari principle. And I was reading back through, because I wasn't on the select committee, so I've come to this bill a little bit late, but I was reading back through the Hansard, sir, and I thought that was a really apt description of the bill, because Steve Mahari was famous. And I actually can't remember what he said it about, but he was famous for the saying that there are things that you say you'll do in opposition that you never do in government. And it's a sort of populist, cheap rhetoric that actually fairly like what we hear from Mr Mitchell. Keep Kiwi Bank's a good example. My colleague Jamie Lee Ross names the example of the Keep Kiwi Bank bill, which Clayton Cosgrove introduced into Parliament and then gave up the portfolio and landed the hospital pass to end all hospital passes over to poor old David Parker, who's also got control of this bill. So I don't know what David Parker has done inside the Labour Party caucus recently, but he seems to have... Yeah, that's right. Mr McIndoe says he must have gone to dinner with Phil Quinn, gone out for Kai and Kororo with Phil Quinn and the right wingers in the Labour Party caucus. We can't possibly have dissenting views inside the gulag that is the Labour Party. So anyway, So this is an example of the Mahari bill, because actually Labor looked at this when they were last in government, and they decided not to do it. And Darian Fenton got lumped with introducing it as a members' bill. We've got to do something for the unions, so let's introduce it as a members' bill. And all the advice was, don't do it. The Cabinet heard the advice. Clayton Crossgrove knows that was the advice. Phil Twyford, thank God, wasn't in the Cabinet back then. He was still struggling to try and win a selection to get into Parliament. But they know that the official advice was against it. They rejected it when they were in government, but then they come into opposition. And it's like a lot of bills we hear from Labor. We heard, I mean, they've twice now, just wait, son, just wait. They've twice, well, your mate up the back bench has scarpered off. So ask yourself why. They've twice now tried to reintroduce the thermal ban legislation. They've twice, I think, tried to reintroduce the biofuels obligation. And this is just another example of a retread bill reintroduced into the House by Labor. So this is a classic example, sir, of the Mahari principle. So, sir, the Select Committee had a good look at this bill, as they did in the 48th Parliament, I think it was, between 2005 and 2008. And on both occasions, they recommended it not pass, and the majority has recommended it not pass in this circumstances, because the reality is contractors are different from people on from normal employees. Their costs are different. Their earnings are calculated in different ways. The structure and the methods of their payments are different. They are different, and they are legally distinct for a very good reason, sir. And actually, my good colleague Andrew Bailey gave an example of how the bill was sort of well-intentioned, but it could, the way the bill is drafted, lead to situations in which contractors are actually worse off, in some cases reasonably substantially. And Parmjit Parmar made that point as well, and I noticed that Maurice Williamson and other speakers in the first reading made that point as well. And we're yet to hear, either in the first reading debate or the second reading, we're yet to hear, or from Mr Mitchell with his voluminous contribution to the House, we are yet to hear an adequate response to how the bill will actually make contractors worse off. The whole point of the bill is to make contractors better off. And that actually there have been examples provided by officials, and I won't relitigate or regurgitate the examples given, but there have been examples given by officials that have been mentioned in the House for how the bill will make contractors worse off, not better off, and we're yet to hear any adequate response to that. And actually, Parliament has an obligation to legislate, not just with good intentions, because too often, sir, Parliament just legislates good intentions, but actually Parliament has an obligation to legislate for things that will work, that are actually based on evidence. And this is a classic example, sir, of how this bill is not. So the officials advised the costs outweighs the benefits. Sir, the Select Committee came to the right conclusion that this was an unworkable bill that would not lead to the improvements for contractors like the bill aims to do. So, sir, that is why the National Government stands in opposition to it.